In a world where good comics are made into bad movies, three nerds with their Overstreet price guides at the ready fight to educate you about the truth of the best comic book stories. The hour of comics is upon us with hosts John Seymour, Keith Bliss, and Jason Gurin. Wow,
Can't hear you, Greg.
I can't hear you.
Rob, can't hear you.
Uh-oh. We got trouble here.
He just doesn't want to talk to us.
He wants us to think that there's something wrong with his mic, so he doesn't have to go. He doesn't have to actually participate.
What about now?
There we go. We got you. We got you on. I might as well introduce the panel right now before we actually get into the content of the show. I have my regular panel here with me. Jason Gurin. How are you, Jason? You look very comfortable.
I am very comfortable. Thank you.
Yes, he looks very comfortable.
I'm very happy that you are so comfortable. And of course, Keith Bliss. How are you, Keith?
Doing well. Can't complain.
All right, that's an improvement on the answer. It's
it could be life sucks. I got bills to pay. I mean, which do you prefer? Just gonna put it out there.
And so this is an exciting episode for two reasons. First of all, it's the first one that's actually going to be on the new platform of The Hour of Comics is Upon Us. And it is the episode where I get to get back. I get revenge on my good friend, Greg Vorob, for having me on the Star Trek show. And I know absolutely nothing about Star Trek. So I said, you know what? You're coming on the comic book show. So, Greg, how are you today?
Hey, how you doing? Am I coming in?
You are coming in, and you are loud and clear.
You've been beamed up.
Yeah, the listeners don't know. Hey, nice one there. Nice reference there. Yes, because the listeners don't know.
Yes.
The listeners don't know I was actually having sound problems before, so I'm coming in good now. I'm glad.
Oh, I thought that was just your voice. I'm sorry. Okay.
Oh.
Anyway. Sorry. Ah. So today we are going to be discussing the 4-issue limited series X-Men versus Avengers, or the X-Men versus the Avengers, however you want to say it. I have something in common with Greg in that I have actually never read it before very recently. It was my idea to have Greg be on this show, and I've never read the series. And so here I am, having just read the series, just like Greg. The only difference is I actually know what was out of place, and Greg was not immediately familiar with it. So I guess let's just jump right in, because this is a somewhat structured arc. Let's start. Mostly. Yeah, let's start with Jason. Jason, what were your thoughts, your overview thoughts of this story arc?
I definitely enjoyed the book. It had been over 20 years since I read it, so I was kind of coming fresh as well. My memory from when I read it in my early teens was pretty much nil. So this was a fresh read for me, basically. And one thing I got to say about comics from that time frame in the late 80s, they took a lot longer to read than they do now. Where as a modern book, I feel like you can just blast through it in like 5 to 10 minutes.
Really?
These older books, I mean, not that it's a bad thing, but they're very wordy, and you just I feel like you almost get more of a bang out of your buck on these older books. Each issue is almost like a 25-minute read sometimes, where opposed to a modern book, you just kind of, just shoot right through it real quick. It seems like more art over words. And
that's my theory, is that like so much of the effort is put into what it looks like, and so they basically don't have to say anything. They're just sort of like, hey, there's an explosion over there, but you already know that. We don't need to say that. So
you get a lot more exposition in these books, where times where they're pointing out things that happened in like X-Men 150 and 200, and they're telling you to go back and kind of check what happened there. Where these days they just kind of gloss over things and just you either know or you don't.
And Keith, your thoughts and views on this story?
I'm definitely with Jason. I was rereading it, and it definitely seemed a little bit more of a slog to go through this time. I'm like, man, It really is much wordier than we remember. And they must have been paid by the word back then, because there's just a lot of things like the attention Kmart shopper panel. I'm like, all right, this is not needed. I was amazing because
and it's the first thing you see.
Right. It's literally like the first page for like third panel or something like that. And they're like, we need to get them out of here quickly. Attention Kmart shoppers.
I actually think that was the splash page. Like the second you open it,
it might have been
just like a giant Kmart ad.
So yeah, it was amazing. And those of us who are old enough to remember that, we remember those announcements when they're like, attention Kmart shopper, Blue Aisle special, or, Joey, your mom is looking for you, or whatever the hell, happened at Kmart that day.
Yeah.
So it kind of brought up all those us growing up back in the day, Greg and I, because we grew up, we were neighbors. So it reminded, me of my childhood. So I got a good little chuckle out of that. But yeah, it's a product of its time. It's very well written and crafted for its time, because there are a lot of interesting little stereotypes they kind of ran with. We'll put it like that.
Right.
And in this one, they tell you like, oh, don't forget to check out Thor issue 150 to see what he's making reference to, or whatever. Where nowadays it's like, read other book. You're like, cool, great. Which one? Narrow it down. So I'm with Jason. It was kind of like a good read and also a tough read at the same time.
And Greg, our new comic reader, what did you think of your first comic reading, like focused comic reading experience?
Yeah, you could call it that. I had fun with it. It's funny because I have no frame of reference of comics today. I thought it was a very quick and easy, nice read. I did. Overall, I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed 1 and 4 the best, and 2 and 3 were kind of like, okay, keep it going. Did I rush through it? It's very questionable. I probably did, but I was still engrossed by the story and just very, very interested. It kept my interest the whole time. Like, I made it a point of reading 1 a day over a course of 4 days, and it was always like, okay, gotta read. It was almost like streaming to get back to another episode of something.
Let me make sure your math is right there. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
that works. All right.
I'm a little insulted, but okay.
Wait, I should be the one who's insulted because I just insulted myself.
Yeah. So yeah, I enjoyed it just fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
To me, I mean, Jason said something interesting in that, like, this was a much slower read than you would see today. As anyone who listens to this knows, I'm not really so much into those newer comics. I didn't notice that it took me all that long. I didn't notice that it was like a slow read. I've read better stories than this. I thought that the story was good. I thought that it was an interesting idea. I thought that the execution was a little boring at times. I thought that it was like, I mean, I could get into it, but I feel like it could have been a 3-issue story and it would have been all the best parts and it wouldn't have like really dragged anywhere. But, we'll get into that because we're going to be touching on each individual book as we go along. So speaking of which, we have our first issue, and I'm just going to give like a very broad overview of what happens in this first issue. The Avengers deal with Magneto's asteroid bay, which is about to make a crash landing on Earth. And then the Avengers insist that Magneto must be brought to justice via trial. The Soviet super soldiers, who that's a whole other story, which we'll be discussing as soon as I'm done talking here, try to apprehend Magneto and bring him to Russia. The X-Men are vacationing or hanging out on like a pier or something. And honestly, in my view, it seemed like that scene was there for no reason other than so that the artists could draw the female X-Men in swimsuits. I'm like, other than that, like, there's no reason why they'd be doing this. And they were really making a point of saying, like, hey, look at me. I'm being shown from behind. I'm like, wow, all right, that's interesting. So among them, though, is Magneto. He's hanging out with them, just like one of them. because he is reformed. This happened in like the previous issues. Greg, you wouldn't know this unless you picked it up from the story itself. Magneto was a villain, and then he became reformed at some point, and now is a good guy with the X-Men. So the Avengers, they take up like 2 pages talking about all the old things that Magneto had done, and
because the Professor Druid
right.
was a new member. Which
right.
Up.
It was like exposition.
Oh yeah,
but it was
Dr. Exposition.
But it was still like Basil Exposition. Yeah, the 2 pages, and they were like, oh, this happened in this issue. This happened in this issue. This happened in this issue. And it's like, oh, well, I'm not going to read those issues. I'll just take your word for it and keep going on with the story. So they confront Magneto and they try to arrest him. The X-Men insist that he's with them and they better not take him. Then the Soviet super soldiers show up and they try to take Magneto with them to Russia. And this sort of like ends in like a 3-way love triangle with Magneto as the bitch in the middle. And that's the end of the first issue. Now, instead of talking about the issue, I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about the 3 teams involved. So let's kind of go through them like I don't know, at a brisk pace, one by one. Keith,
Sir.
your thoughts on like the Avengers in like just kind of the story and this
they were definitely kind of gung-ho for the time, but I get it. It's very much a product of the time. You see them nowadays and they tend to be a little more level-headed, where in this first issue they're like, we must get him, go get him.
Yeah.
And they just go like gung-ho. And even like Captain America, who's usually like the voice of reason's like, nope, we have to capture him and bring him in. He's like, they were all on board of capturing him / killing him,
right.
Because She-Hulk and who was the other one that she was talking to? We're talking about how like the CIA and who?
Was it the Black Knight?
I think so. Yeah, I think you're right. And they were talking about how like Russia and the CIA wanted to have Magneto assassinated, and they're like, "Come on, guys, let's pump the brakes." And they were like, "Let's do it." And you're like, "Wow!" So just like the tonal difference between then and now is impressive.
Mm-hmm.
The characters they were good enough. I did appreciate the fact that this was when they had She-Hulk and Monica and the Black Knight, not the group that we're normally used to. The Trinity. Yes, there was Thor there, but this was wounded Thor, not in his prime Thor. So it was cool. I did appreciate it. The art style was good enough. Again, this is for a product of its time. I did appreciate how they gave Monica some legs and let her like flex her powers and abilities, because if you've never heard of this character or seen this character until fairly recently in the MCU, you don't know, like she is probably like the second or third most powerful being on the team.
Oh.
And she's a complete total badass, and this kind of shows you a little bit of her flex.
Nice.
Greg,
do you feel up to talking about the Avengers as a team?
Well, they didn't do much for me. The Marvel for me aren't really my favorite characters, and this was like, it might as well be generic superheroes. But and I know that it was the time. I know that they were still evolving. It was 1987, even though they had been around forever at that point. They still had forever to go. Captain America, I found the most interesting because it's Captain America. The other ones I kind of felt. I know Thor is a major character, but they didn't give him much to do here, really. Got a couple of wheels of the hammer, but not much.
Yeah.
But all the other characters, She-Hulk and Captain Marvel, Dr. Druid was boring AF. And I'm like, okay, this must be a precursor to Doctor Strange. And he was, in a way. It was, I looked it up, they decided to discontinue him. And Doctor Strange became the Dr. Druid of these. So, but that being said, the story still held, and much like how Kyle Bain referred to Kirk in The Wrath of Khan, refer to Star Trek The Undiscovered Podcast, episode 12. You see what I did there?
But anyway, I see, very clever, yes.
Yes, but what I really liked about it was Magneto's point of view.
Okay.
And I was very interested. I mean, I didn't know. I mean, obviously, I saw what happened before and that he was the X-Men's greatest enemy, therefore an enemy of the world. He is very much an ends justify the means villain. I don't know what came after this, but he grabbed me right away and he intrigued me right away. And I was very much, that's what I was waiting for. That's what kept me coming back and not putting the comics down and say, John, I don't want to do this, was Magneto and okay, I really want to know his intentions. And I must say, the end when we get there did surprise me. I must say. But I think they did that on purpose, I think.
Well, so for stories, at least of the time in the 80s, especially when they had like those limited series, the end is like usually pretty open-ended. So, you know, like it was the style that they chose to go by. Jason, Avengers.
So I felt in this whole series like the Avengers were not the team we were rooting for in this whole crossover. The entire time we kind of were getting them as not so much villains, but they were just kind of assholes. And, you know, even though Magneto's been the villain for so long and they went over all the horrors that he's done over the years, you know, we're starting to get to the point with him where we're accepting him as the anti-hero now and joining up with the X-Men. And I guess for me, I'm just been more of an X-Men fan to begin with anyway. So I was immediately just leaning to the X-Men side as far as reading this. Like, oh man, what are these Avengers doing? Like, can't they see the light here and see what the X-Men are trying to do? And then obviously we had the whole Soviets, which made it even more interesting.
So we can kind of like graze over the X-Men as a team because obviously like Magneto is part of the X-Men team. It's like Magneto, but he's really the catalyst of the story. He has a good story within the story, but it's like we have our three teams, the X-Men, the Avengers, and the Soviet super soldiers. I want to take a minute just to talk about the Soviet super soldiers because I'm gonna like just speak my 2 cents and I'm gonna see if everyone else here kind of feels the same way that I do. I didn't care for them being a part of the story. I kind of felt like they felt kind of wedged in because the writers realized that there wasn't enough material to write 4 issues with just the X-Men and the Avengers. So they had to add another team to add a bit more strife. But it's just sort of like, okay, the story plot line is interesting to me. Both teams are superheroes. One team sees Magneto as like horrible and evil and must pay for his sins, and the other team sees him as reformed, and that's what they're fighting over. They're not fighting each other, they're fighting over like someone else's freedom or lack thereof. The giant Russian talking bear, I guess, was pretty funny. Reminded me of the Cleveland show. But other than that,
Awesome.
other than that, I really like every time they were on the page, I was like, all right, can we just get them through? Because those.
Well, I think there's a purpose to it, though, John.
Right.
I feel like they had them there so that we could, you know, obviously at the end, which we'll get to, but
sure.
4 of them being mutants and 1 of them not, I played a big part in this whole story too.
I agree with that. I just feel like that whole like insufferable, everything that they say was in parentheses because they're speaking Russian. And it's like, okay, there is no need for that. Just have them speak English. Just enough with the parentheses. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Come on, comrade.
Keith.
Sir.
Can you talk about the Soviet super soldiers?
Well, I think the story needed them because in reality, if the Avengers were to show up to the X-Men, they probably could have talked it out and spoken to Magneto, and he probably would have gone along peacefully. They needed the Russian team of superheroes, and we'll use that in quotations,
right?
Because they show up and Magneto's like, make some sort of comment and they just straight off start attacking. So they needed something to like trigger the actual big battle amongst the teams, and that was the catalyst. Just like, was it issue 2 or 3 where they're on the tanker and the Crimson Dynamo blows a hole through the side of the tanker to sink the boat and kill everybody?
Yeah, that was 3.
Right, that was issue 3. Yeah. So, you know, there was that as well. So they needed them. Yes, they were a bit more of a plot device than, you know, anything else. And yes, they even make a comment about how they're mutants as well. And the Crimson Dynamo was kind of like, yeah, I knew that. But you could tell he was like holding it back. He's like, yeah, I know you guys are mutants. I'm not going to kill you, just the other mutants. And you're like, no, Not today.
The Dynamo was our racist uncle in this story.
Exactly. He was the extreme racist uncle. And I'm not really sure which iteration. I think this was the second Dynamo pilot. I'm not really sure. I'd have to go, look at the comics and find out. But they had a handful of them, and they kind of progressed through different levels. And at one point, one was a friend of Tony Stark's. So, yeah, they were fine. They were, what they had to be, just a plot device. There was no deep philosophical whatever, but would the story have been different without them? 100%. I believe we wouldn't have had the same, conflict as we did. There still might have been a trial in the fourth issue, but in terms of, the tension, it would have gone differently.
And Greg, your thoughts on this Russian team with the giant bear, who apparently I didn't even know was just able to transform into human at will.
He's Colossus,
but decides.
I don't know. I'm kind of with you, John. There were so many characters in it at that point that I couldn't really keep track, but I kind of felt like they were a comic relief in a way. I don't know if that's what the writers intended, but for me it was, because the whole reading the first issue, I really felt like it was light, and I really felt like it was like that lighter side of comic books.
Right.
And I think in the first issue it was. And then it progressively got more character driven.
I agree with you.
In a darker way too. But I kind of felt like the Soviet soldiers, you have the bear, you had the Mr. Mixoplex looking troll, and I kind of like got Guardians of the Galaxy vibe from them.
Yeah.
Sort of underdogs, and one's a bear. I just kind of felt like they were there for a little bit of comic relief.
Yeah.
Needed, but comic relief.
Yeah. Okay. I can understand. And it's like the way that I saw it is like there were 4 characters in this story. And those characters were the X-Men, the Avengers, the Soviet super soldiers, and Magneto is he's the only one who is like his own character, independent of other people. So that's kind of the way that I saw it throughout the whole story. So moving on, because we have brushed on Magneto and the X-Men here, it's all sort of like, Magneto's reformed and all good. So moving on to issue number 2, picking up right where issue 2 leaves off, the 3 teams fight over Magneto. The X-Men escape with Magneto onto some aircraft, while the Avengers and the Soviet super soldiers fight on land. Magneto excuses himself to find his asteroid bay, and in doing so finds his old helmet. The Avengers find him and try to arrest him, but he holds his own. Then the X-Men show up to protect Magneto, and it's an even bigger fight. Long story short, the X-Men escape on the aircraft with Magneto, but they don't realize that Dr. Druid, Greg, your favorite, the mind power guy, has snuck on board with them so he can let the Avengers know where the X-Men are bringing Magneto. That's really the whole of issue number 2. It's a fight and an escape. I'm sorry, what?
Well, don't forget he blew up asteroid M.
Right.
And
Okay.
He said explosion. He said like C4, some explosive thingamajiggy, because that's all they said was, I said explosives, whatever, insert object, and he blew up the asteroid so they couldn't get the advanced circuitry and stuff. And that was literally word for word what he said. It was like,
but he did have his helmet back.
Yes, he did have his murder helmet.
Yeah. And there was probably my favorite line in all 4 of the issues was Wolverine going to Magneto, "What are you doing with that pot back on your head again?"
Yes, I love that. So anyway, let's go across the table here. Greg, you want to talk about issue number 2?
Yeah, I mean, issue 2 was a bridge the gap issue for me, and it's funny because it's irrelevant, but I had another bridge the gap experience today with a different franchise, and it didn't make me as enthusiastic as I was after reading 1, because 1 pulled me in. And then in reading 2, it's like you said, it's very uneventful. And I mean, it's basic enough, and it gets you to, now I got to read issue 3, but in and of itself, it didn't do anything to, I guess, until the very end to go, okay, is this going to now, because I felt like issue 1 really did a lot to get you into the story.
Yep.
It kind of seems like issue 2 was, if they're already in it, they're going to stay in it no matter what we do now.
Mm-hmm.
But I kind of felt like it showed, because I'm not a big enough fan, which is the reason I'm here, because I think it would have kept people coming back that were big fans, but it almost lost me there. But, you get enough to the end, and I was still interested in what is Magneto's motivation here. So it still kept me, but I just kind of felt like it was a disappointment after 1, which I felt like, for me, it had, the whole beginning was a little campy, and I think it was supposed to be.
Yeah,
because it starts at Kmart, like we said, and it's, come Captain America, yes Thor, yes She-Hulk. When they're calling themselves by the hero of their name, it reminded me very much of 66 Batman. It really did.
Mm-hmm.
And then it kind of got to, okay, well, this Magneto guy, there's something up with him, so that's what issue 1 did for me. With issue 2, it's like, wow, I don't really think you made much effort there, writers, and I'm going to have to stay with that because issue 1 made me feel like things are going to get more exciting, which they did get. Issue 2 really did nothing for me in that sense.
Yeah. Well, in as much as, like I said, when limited series end, the ending tends to be a bit open-ended. Issue 1 usually doesn't have a whole lot of action. Issue 1 usually just takes the time to set stuff up for the story, and that was cool for issue 1. When issue 2 seemed to be doing the same thing, I was like, what the hell, man? Why are you still setting up the story? Like, get into the story. So let's move on to Jason.
Yeah, I think Greg really said it well. As far as issue 2 kind of being the weakest of the group, I would say, other than the mystery of what Magneto's motivations are, I mean, there really wasn't much to it.
Right.
That was really the only hook in that whole issue of just like, all right, he's got to be up to something else. Hopefully they get to that in issue 3.
Right. And Keith?
What? I fell asleep. Who?
No. We're talking about Home Alone.
Oh yeah, it was really kind of crazy how he set those things with the stuff and he hit the guy in the face with the stuff.
No, that's X-Men versus Avengers.
Oh, okay, that's the 2014 one. My bad.
Right.
So issue number 2 was definitely a bit of a snooze. It did it moved the story along. You got the whole, like we were talking about, the meteor blowing up, or the rest of his meteorite blowing up, and him getting his little garbage can helmet and so on and so forth, and you get the battle between the 3 teams.
Right.
But I think there was supposed to be, or trying to be, that implied him showing that he really has changed, because he didn't have to save the Avengers and everybody, but he did. He didn't kill anybody in that issue. Not how nice of him. And he also saved all of them. So he had ample opportunity to, rip the armor off of Titanium Man or the Crimson Dynamo or crush them into little, tin cans or whatnot. And he didn't do any of that. So I think, not deliberately, but it did show he does had, or at this time was showing, a certain amount of restraint, because instead of him going straight evil maniacal and just murdering everybody on the screen, or flying away and letting that giant nuclear explosion level everybody, he saves everybody. He takes the time to help. And that's supposed to, I guess, show him turning over a new leaf. But otherwise, it was a very generic paint by numbers, just like Group A meets Group B, fight happens and somebody gets away.
Right. Yeah, I think that a lot of the appeal by this point in the story, even though the issue is pretty boring and I'm like, okay, I want something fun to be happening here. I found myself asking, is Magneto actually changed? Did this asteroid crash landing onto Earth kind of make him realize, I enjoy being a villain, but I'm going to pretend to be a good guy and save people's lives and all that stuff so I can continue and follow through with my plan? So I found myself enticed to go on to find out if he was going to stay good or if he was going to go back to villainy. So
turn heel, I believe is the term.
Turn heel.
Turn heel. Wrestling term.
Yeah, all right. Hulk Hogan. So issue 3. This was actually kind of a fun one. I enjoyed this one. Dr. Druid talks to the Avengers via telepathy, and then the X-Men discover him, and Rogue knocks him out. That's fun, isn't it? Like, cool. We can get him out of the way. So we get a run through Singapore. Like, I'm in Singapore. Okay. Then the X-Men and the Soviets end up on a ship. Fun. In combat, the robot, which is controlled by the bald guy with the weird shaped head.
Titanium Man.
The Titanium Man. I have trouble keeping track of all these people's names. So Titanium Man, cool. He destroys the ship, which causes it to sink. The
Crimson
Avengers.
Dynamo.
It was Crimson Dynamo.
Crimson Dynamo blows the hole. Yes, the red
is it?
guy, the red armor blows a hole in the
The
engine.
racist
room.
uncle at it again.
Yeah, racist uncle kills everybody.
Yeah, well, he tried to anyway. He didn't
Fair.
succeed. So the Avengers rush to the scene to help save the people on the ship, effectively uniting them with the X-Men. So after all that, now the X-Men and the Avengers are friends again. So they save everyone who was on board the ship, and the ship sinks into the ocean. The Soviets admit that they had taken it too far, and Magneto escapes onto another ship. Keith.
Sir.
Issue number 3.
It was a good setup to show that, when push comes to shove, they will, the Avengers and the X-Men will do what is right. They did save everybody on the ship. They helped even save the Russian, super team because the bear couldn't swim, which was very fun to watch.
You're helping
very
me?
entertaining. Yes. You're helping me? Well, if you didn't weigh so much, I can transform. Okay. Couldn't do that sooner.
Well, it was a matter of they were trying to get him like through some kind of tight space.
Something, yeah.
He's like, I can transform into human. Okay, now.
But it leaves me vulnerable. And She-Hulk makes that, yes, it does. And I'm like, awkward cringe.
Oh, yes. All right. Anyway, and did you notice that she was kind of smiling when she said that?
Yes, she was. I was like, that is just cringy. So
she wasn't even disgusted. Okay, anyway, go ahead.
Yes. Yeah, that was a very awkward. I'm like, no. Like I'm offended by this. This is a very awkward moment. Otherwise, it wasn't terrible that this is the plot device to get Magneto to escape.
Mm-hmm.
Spoilers. But it does show that Crimson Dynamo is really the ultimate villain of this whole story arc, just because he was willing to sink a ship full of innocent individuals just to kill all the mutants. And it took the Avengers pointing that out to the rest of the team of, Russian superheroes to say, like, listen, that wasn't us. It wasn't, Magneto. And it was your boy over here in the red armor. And they're like, oh, okay, well, maybe we might want to, look into that. And you're like, really?
Yes.
It's a tanker ship and you just spilled who knows how much oil all over everywhere. And you're like, maybe we kind of overreacted a little bit. Whatever.
Who cares?
No big deal. But this was the setup for Magneto to escape, get to, where was it again? Taiwan. China. And get to the next story point. He meets some underground resistance and he sees what their struggles are. And this kind of helps him make a choice of things and actions that he wants to do, because he's alluded through the last couple of issues, since he's put the circuitry in his helmet, which I still find amazingly funny,
Yes.
that he can do stuff with it, but yet we don't know what the stuff is until the next issue, and then you finally find out.
Right. Yeah, right, exactly. Like, you don't even know, and then they kind of squeeze it into the final issue. Jason.
So obviously, as reading this, we're here for the Avengers and the X-Men, and the Soviet superhero team is the team that we're really not that interested in. But they have a lot of word balloons anyway throughout the first couple issues, and I feel like issue 3 was kind of the payoff for them, where all the setup from issue 1 and 2, where they're kind of bickering a little bit between themselves, almost saying like, "Hey, we're mutants too. Why are you treating us like this?" At the Crimson Dynamo, and then for him to basically become full villain in issue 3. That's where we've now pointed our anger at as the reader. And we're kind of siding almost with the rest of the team. Like, you know what? These guys aren't so bad. They're mutants too. And another day, they could just be hanging out with the X-Men and just, they could be on that beach with them at the beginning. And, it just felt good to see that part come around. I felt
nice. Yeah, Greg, what did you think of the makeshift Titanic scene?
Yeah, forgive me though. Isn't this where we meet those other the little girl that's a mutant?
That's issue
No,
4.
that's issue 4. That's issue
Oh
4.
my goodness!
Yeah.
Then I don't know what happened in 3. Well, I
In
could tell you
3
this
Boat
much.
sank. The
in 3,
Titanic went down.
Yeah, they're on a ship that's sinking and they're saving people, and then the X-Men and the
Wow.
Avengers unite. Yeah.
Well, I remember 4. I remember that happening in 4, and then all of 4 being the trial. But no, okay. But here's where it started to become that parable that is the X-Men. Now, putting Avengers aside and putting the mutants in there, the whole lesson that we can learn about with that X-Men that I've always appreciated, as little as I know about the X-Men, is that mutants. Now, here they've saved the world many times, but that humanity sees mutants as not human. They see them as less than, and they all must be destroyed. And then it's so amazing the racism, mirroring what really goes on with racism with the mutants, and the fact that it was relevant then, and unfortunately, it's still very relevant now. So it was very much issue 3 grabs you a little bit better than issue 2 does, because issue 1 is fun, it's funny, it's exciting, it has funny parts, things are getting started, and then 2 slows down. Well, 3 starts to show you, especially me, what I really appreciated about being a non-reader. Now, you can't call me a non-fan, but a non-reader of these guys.
Right.
That, okay, now you're getting the message of what the X-Men represent. And I mean, I don't even think this was like, I think it was Jason that said before, somebody said before, the Avengers are kind of just there. This is an X-Men story. It's an X-Men driven story.
Oh, absolutely. 100%.
Yeah.
But it's,
Yeah.
I don't know if I agree that the Avengers are kind of just there, but it's
maybe if we're talking about issue 3, perhaps, because this is where I'm getting what I mean. The Avengers definitely represent, like, the Avengers are us. The Avengers are. It's like, that saying, I don't know if I like very much, but that be the change you want to see in the world. Well, in this case, it's the Avengers. In that story. But yeah, that it hits you. It hits you in the gut that what they're really saying. And then, of course, we find out in 4, like, more so, who one of the main villains are.
Oh yeah.
Is not even a mutant or anybody with powers. So it's a real wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We have a problem here. Symbolism there. Yeah.
So, like you say, yeah, like that's one really cool thing that I found about Stan Lee's superheroes and superhero teams. They all represent something. They're not just there for no reason. And the X-Men are like, they are hardcore civil rights. That's what the X-Men is about. And that's like, it's really cool. I don't know if you read that or if you realize that on your own, but that's like, it's cool that you picked up on that.
Yeah, the non-reader picked up. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If I was just, because I tried to read these like I never heard of these characters before. And unfortunately, there were probably too many for me to, with the exception of Magneto, there were too many to, I don't mean this the way it sounds, but to care about. And there were just too many characters. There were too many characters in the story. But yes, that's, if there's any lesson to extract from it, that's it. And then of course, I was raring to go, as a perfect segue. I was raring to go for issue 4 because because there was also a story here that had to finish. I mean, it was, of course, open ended, but then there was the what are Magneto's intentions and motivations?
Yes,
and so we're about to find that out.
And so now, issue 4, I have things to say about issue 4, but let me just describe it first, and then we'll round table. So. People did think that Magneto sank the ship, right? Was that like a thing, or am I making that
was
up?
Issue 4 that it was on the news. They
Yeah.
blamed
Falsely
him for
claimed him.
it.
Right.
And then
So-
that's when you cut to the Avengers talking to some government spook, and they're like, "What do you mean? We know it was the Russians." And they're like, "Well, do we?"
It's Magneto. I mean, look at him. He's got the red helmet. So anyway, Magneto ends up in China and gets recognized, which apparently like disrupted someone's sting operation. They were like, "Oh, that damn fool!" So they're like, "Go grab him." So he's randomly rescued by some dude who can always tell if someone is lying, which
That was
is
the
like,
underground.
yeah, which is like, it's a power that serves no real purpose to the plot. It just
It's an
kind of
amazing
like,
poker player.
yeah, great poker player. I won me a small fortune. That's cool. So
He
anyway,
has the power of Wonder Woman's rope or lasso.
that,
Yes, the
well, there
lasso
you
of
go.
truth.
So after trying to change Captain America's mind by force, Magneto realizes that he has to stand trial because it would be unethical. Now, here's what Magneto has wanted, I guess, the whole time. It would be unethical to try to save the world by manipulating all the bad guys' minds. So we get like, he's like, okay, I'll go to trial and I'll accept whatever it is that they say. And Ted Koppel tells us all
Yes.
about it. Ted Koppel, there he is in all his glory on the TV screen. So after promising to accept the judge's verdict no matter what, Magneto manages to get his helmet, which contains the mind manipulating device, as we all were talking about. And he uses that to manipulate the judge's mind to exonerate him on the basis that his death would be detrimental to all mutant kind.
Or did he?
Well, we'll decide that. So he then destroys the helmet so it wouldn't tempt him again. The judge, in fact, does exonerate Magneto, but receives no argument from the two other judges, leading him to believe that it would have been the outcome regardless. Leaving the court, he realized that his actions may have protected mutants, but has put humans in mortal danger, and he immediately regrets his actions. I think this is a really cool, like, sort of like what's ethical and what's not. It's a very philosophical argument about what, like, do the ends justify the means, and I think that's really cool. So let's go around. Jason, what's your view on this final episode?
I thought this was a good finish to this book for sure.
Mhm.
The courtroom, the drama was all there. Magneto, you see inside of his head a little bit with the excessive word balloons of the time,
Right.
and we want to, he's deciding whether or not he wants to go through with his plan, which is kind of villainous. It's not true villainy, but it's right on the cusp of it. And just seeing him go back and forth, and just decide not to go full out and revert. I thought it was pretty well done, and I like the way the whole story concluded.
I could see like an actual hero struggling with this, saying, I could just make bad guys not be bad guys, and there would just be world peace. But who am I to control the way a person thinks, et cetera, et cetera. Like,
And you have to bounce that off Captain America a little bit too.
right? Yeah. And so like, in that moment, he was like, what do you think now? And he's like, I still feel the same. So yeah, he's like, oh my God, it's not only about mind manipulation. So Keith,
Yes,
how you doing?
sir. I'll get by.
You live by the beach.
Exactly. Life's a beach, and then you get sunburned.
Aha.
Oh, so the issue 4 was an interesting kind of take because of the fact that it starts off with him being attacked or being yelled at by a local, saying like, he's like, "You mutie, I know who you are," and all of a sudden just literally erupts into just ridiculous violence, and then he turns around and gets saved, and it's by that local mutant organization and the guy who can tell the truth or knows when you're telling the truth, and then he has somebody else in the group that can sense mutants, which is kind of a cool ability, but they don't really explore it. She's literally like on like 3 pages and then gets killed.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It was a little that I know they had to cover a lot of ground in a short period of time. So, he meets this, what is it called? The Light. And you're like, okay, cool, whatever. And you're like, what? Fine. Some cheesy name, move on. And then, you keep going through. And then all of a sudden, the government or some military organization just like blows a hole in the wall. Literally the next panel. It's like, oh, here, have some coffee. Boom. And you're like, shit, that escalated quickly. There's no like seeing them follow him or any setup to this at all whatsoever. Just straight like carnage. And this is when he realizes, like, okay, I should probably turn myself in because all I'm doing is causing needless slaughter, which is true because these guys blow a hole in the wall and start killing everybody on sight. And then, you do finally you finally find out what's in that briefcase and the weird circuitry, which I keep making fun of. And it's a device that allows you to persuade, use psychic powers. And he even makes a comment that the reason why he's never used this was because Professor X is no longer on planet.
Right.
See issue number 482,906 to find out where the hell he is. And that's why he kind of sat on this device long enough, because he knew that if he were to try to use this and persuade people that, Professor X could undo all of the shenanigans. Mm-hmm. So I kind of get it. It's fine. It is what it is. It's I'm not going to say lazy writing, but it's an excuse as to why he hadn't tried doing this prior to this or since then.
I definitely feel like there had to be a mention of why he never used it before, because it would be horrendous continuity if there was not at least something that like addressed it. So yeah.
I do like there's a one of the panels after he's used it for the first time, where Captain America is just seething with rage. He's like, "You've never had mental powers before. How did you do this?" And like he just looks like he wants to rip Magneto's arm off and beat him to death with it. Like, you don't see Captain get like that deranged mad very often.
Nope.
And he's like, "I haven't, you were right." And he just goes into this very calm explanation as to how this has all transpired. And then he proceeds to use the helmet on Captain. I think the flaw with this, or with his logic, for many reasons, but the most basic of flaws was Captain America didn't hate mutants. So he wasn't necessarily changing his mind because he didn't have that hatred. So that's why it didn't work on Captain America, because if you don't have hatred and you're trying to remove the hatred, 0 minus 0 is still going to be 0. So he's still going to have that same perception of Magneto. He's still going to think of him as this terrorist and this crazy wackadoo. And then he does, and that's kind of like the breaking point where he's like, fine, I'll turn myself in. And then you go in front of this tribunal and it's a shit show from the start. The readers know as well as Magneto that it's a sham and he's going to be killed. He thinks he's going to be killed for the wrong reason. He thinks the lead judge is a mutant as well, except he's not. He's not racist. Yeah. He's just a raging racist. So
I love the behind the scenes where the judges are talking and they're like, "Oh, well, I'm not going to print it that way so that I won't sound racist." And I'm like, okay.
Yeah, the fact that one judge is like, that kind of sounds slightly racist. He's like, I won't make it sound like that. And you're like, Jesus Christ, the other judge has to point out how racist that sounds. Like, how bad is that?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's fine. They had to, again, have the voice of reason. And he gets because somehow his powers of magnetism work halfway around the globe. He's able to get his helmet and bring it all the way back to him and persuade the judge. And I do appreciate the last panel where Magneto is out in front of the courthouse and he sees all of this rage and he's like, "Oh shit, I didn't expect this to happen. I expected that if I die, the war is going to happen, not I lived and the war is going to happen." He was trying to do a good deed, but it went, no good deed goes unpunished kind of scenario.
It's sort of like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. If he died, there'd be a war on mutants. He lives, there's a war with the humans. So it's like, oh, okay, yeah. It is a bit ambiguous because, like he said, like, oh, was he going to rule that way anyway? Because even though the judge might have been racist, he still judges based on the law, not based on his own racism, I suppose. Greg, you have not been forgotten. What did you think about issue number 4?
Okay, not to be misconstrued, so I was very happy with the conclusion. I thought it held my interest, but not to be misconstrued. I'm going to take a guess that X-Men versus the Avengers isn't the most popular series in the world.
It's not, and I knew absolutely nothing about it. We will be the only podcast about this miniseries. I'm like, I can't find anything about it. So anyway,
that was my educated guess that this can't be a very popular story. It probably didn't win any awards for artistry. There was nothing remarkable about this series, but it was enjoyable in the sense that, it's a quick, fun read that keeps you interested. And you find out Magneto is an anti-hero here. His intentions were good. But as Captain America said, but it's not ethical. And it was, Captain America and what he represents is saying, I have every right to hate mutants, even if I did.
Mm-hmm.
It might not be right, but that's my business. And that's this person's business and this person's business and everything. And then I think we found out, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, that there was a congressman or a lawmaker there that was part of this sort of conspiracy. I guess I didn't read it right.
I mean, I don't know. Like
I think there was someone who wanted the war to happen and they were within the government. Okay.
Well, the judges were, the way the judges were talking about it is kind of like he was fine with it. He's like, well, if we go to war, we go to war. I think
exactly.
That's how you could take it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's
we'll go to war, we'll go to war thing. Exactly. And then it's all over. Magneto comes out of it. I do think it's funny that they took that time and funny, if you want to call it that. They introduced the little girl.
Yeah.
Like you said, Keith, she's dead in 3 panels.
Mm-hmm.
And they made it a point to introduce her. And then, Magneto says, oh, okay, to, who was that, Captain Marvel he sends to get her?
Captain Marvel, yes.
The one who keeps flying all over the place,
So he says, Captain Marvel, go get her. Sorry, she's dead. Oh, all right. And then I was like, okay, this is not...
He's like, well, shit, plan B.
This is not scholar writing right here, but I like the message of it. And I like seeing Magneto's journey, and I know I don't know what comes after. I don't have any intention to find out, really. But no, I enjoyed reading this, and I enjoyed the experience again. It brought me back to when I was a kid, when I did kind of read comics, but it also solidified that the DC characters are who my favorites are. Marvel characters really do anything. However, I do realize as I top this opinion of issue 4 on here, it is the best example of these characters. It's an example of these characters. And what it really did was, I mean, whoever wrote it really loved Magneto. This was Magneto's story. I kind of really latched on to him as if he's the protagonist of the entire thing. And it's called X-Men versus Avengers, but it might as well have been called, the entire series might as well have been called The Judgment of Magneto.
I feel that would have been a better title. X-Men versus Avengers was a very misleading title. I think. So,
that's what I picked up about how it's probably not. That probably disappointed a lot of fans.
From start to finish, I am like, this is not X-Men versus Avengers. This is everyone wants to arrest Magneto, and Magneto is working his way around that. And there's like superheroes involved. And so I'm gonna say, Greg, that I agree with you. Your opinion that it was not a very popular series. It's not. There's no Wikipedia page. There's no podcast about it. There is barely anything on YouTube about it. I'm like, wow, people really don't want to talk about this thing. And truth be told, if I had known the story before I suggested the podcast, I probably wouldn't have suggested the podcast. But I was like, I'm in it now. I might as well.
Now that you did,
yeah,
you have brought awareness to X-Men versus Avengers, and now everyone's going to go out and read it, and know that a layman from off the street of let alone comics, Marvel, let alone anything else, that never read Marvel, go, it's a nice read.
People are going to be like, oh, what's this podcast about? X-Men versus Avengers? No. And move on to the next one. So I hope that doesn't happen. I hope that people will listen and at least get some sort of goodness listening to this podcast, because I'm good with the words. So
Words are hard. We understand, John.
Yeah, words are hard. So I'm gonna give this, because I didn't hate it, so to speak. I was just very unintrigued most of the time. I'm gonna give it a 6.5 out of 10. I'll go around. Jason, what would you give it?
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with that number. I read it as a kid, which, like I said, I don't really remember. And even reading it now, it was good. It was better than I expected it to be. And just one thing I want to touch on too before we finish is that this iteration of the X-Men are not the original 5, obviously.
No.
And those 5 probably would not have gone along with any of this and would have just handed Magneto right over to Captain America, because this group of X-Men on their own are a bunch of anti-heroes. You have Rogue, Storm, and Wolverine, who are all considered, not villains, but they've been on the cusp as well. So just this
can't
group
forget
of
Dazzler.
Well, Space Dazzler.
She's a dancer too, isn't she?
She's a rock star. She was a pop star.
Yeah.
Just having this group of X-Men, that you could see why they would almost defend Magneto, whereas other X-Men might not.
I get you. Makes me kind of want to read the original X-Men series. They were that lineup until the mid 70s. So it was probably a good 12 years as that lineup before it became the Wolverine lineup.
The original lineup became the X-Force.
Yeah. So anyway, Keith,
Sir,
your rating on this story.
So I feel like there's a little bit more on this one. So I think readers will probably confuse this story, this X-Men versus Avengers, with Avengers versus X-Men, which they flipped the title, and that was more of a recent story.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I'm going to make it specific that it's the 1987 title. So
oh no, I know that. I know what you're going to do, but I'm just saying, I think why some readers have never gone back and read this in general is because they don't realize that it's actually 2 different stories.
Right.
And you see a total different, story. There's a whole different, it's kind of a very kind of similar in certain respects, but I digress. That's a rant for a different day. I'm going to go with you guys. I'm going to keep it, 6.5, just because it's not terrible writing. It's not the best writing. It's a product of its time.
Yeah.
Does it have a message? Yes. Don't brainwash strangers. And
that's a good message.
There's your message right there, kids.
Yes.
And knowing is half the battle. It's fun. Would I read it again? Probably not. Am I glad I read it this time? Yes. Or reread it, I should say, because I read it a billion years ago when I was a little kid. Yeah, sure, because it brought back all those memories of Kmart and all the, again, product of its time. So it was sufficient enough.
All right. And Greg, your rating?
Well, now I want to do Avengers versus X-Men. That sucks. Now I got to come back. Okay. Yes.
You guys can do that show.
All right. It's a solid 6.
Oh, even worse than the rest of us. Okay.
Solid 6. 6 is a passing grade.
All right. Okay. I respect it. So, and you know what? I'm going to tell you this. I've been on the Star Trek podcast, and every time you ask me what my rating is, I say I can't really give one. So I respect that you were able to produce one, and that's good. That's nice. So anyway, I guess let's just get into plugs now, so we can get the fuck out of here, and I can get this up for people to listen to how shitty this story is. Hey, Greg, our guest of honor.
Yeah.
Tell us where people can find you.
I'll spell my last name. V as in Victor, O-R-O-B as in boy, Vorob, Greg Vorob. Find me on Facebook under that name, Greg Vorob. If I see you're mutual friends with these 3 guys here, I'll take you without a message. You might want to message me if you heard me on any of the podcasts and want to add me from there. On Twitter, find me at Greg_Vorob. At YouTube, you can see my acting stuff at Greg Vorob. And for podcasts, of course, listen to Star Trek The Undiscovered podcast. At the time this airs, I guess we're back in 2 weeks, I guess. At recording time, we're back in 2 weeks. Hey, even though I'm not supposed to plug it because that's part of the joke, check out MSV Podcast Presents The Fake and the Whimsy. You'll find that your very own John Seymour's on that too, and they'll wonder, well, why hasn't John mentioned it? It's actually part of the point.
Yes.
We're actually not supposed to talk about it, but hey, why don't you go give it a listen and see maybe why I'm plugging it? I could say it that way, right, John? That's a good way to say it.
Of course
Yeah.
you can say it. I mean, I don't plug it because I forget to plug it. So, that's I generally
you could have saved yourself. I set you up so that you could say, "Oh yeah, I don't plug it because that's part of the joke."
I mean, I generally don't follow your instructions. So, anyone who knows me knows that. So, I look, I'm going to come out and be honest. I forget. I plugged the fuck out of your other show, the Star Trek podcast.
Thank you.
But
Thank you very much.
I forget to do the fake and whimsy.
Because subconsciously, you know that the rule of fake and the whimsy is that we do not speak of the fake and the whimsy. That's why.
Exactly right. It's like
Let's just go with that. Let's go with that. Yeah.
Like Fight Club.
You literally took the first rule of Fight Club and applied it to the fake and the whimsy.
Fake and the whimsy.
Yes, exactly.
Keith.
Sir.
Stuff and things.
Stuff and things.
Yes.
So I'm presently scheduled for a 3037 appearance on that Star Trek show. I think we'll be talking about the next generation, or the generation after last. I don't even know at this point. I also am on another podcast. We talk about superhero movies. It's called Happiness in Darkness. DJ Nick, our mutual friend who was on everybody's podcast about everything, he and I discussed different movies. This week we talked about the Flashpoint Paradox, which is a DC animated short, which is based on a comic book. You can check us out on Facebook in Happiness and Darkness. We're also on Spotify, Apple, all the major platforms. Give us a listen, give us a like, drop a comment, drop a recommendation. We listen to our fans. We like to review what you guys want to hear us review. So, you can reach me there. You can also send me a friend request, Keith Bliss, like happy, but not really, on Facebook. I'm down here in the good old North Carolina area. So, yeah.
That's good and old.
Yes, all of them. Cover all my bases.
Nice. Jason.
And I am Jason Gurin, and as Greg may have just pointed out, I maybe should be spelling my last name. Maybe that's why nobody's reaching out to me.
That's exactly why.
That's why, yeah.
No request.
Yes.
So if you're looking for me, my last name is spelled Gurin, and like Nancy. And you can find me on Facebook, and I'm an admin on a group called Comic Book Villains, where we have a lot of fun and talk a lot about comics. And there is a contest still running on there, and you could win a spot on a future episode of this show.
This show, exactly. As for me, John Seymour, JON space S as in Sam, EYMOUR. That's me on Facebook. I am sitting behind a drum set wearing a Mickey Mouse shirt. Also, listen to Bullshit Hour with John Seymour. That's me. I have been a little bit separated from that show because I've been trying to build content for this show, but I am still active on it. I will be doing it more and more and more because people like doing it, and I like doing it, and hopefully people like listening to it. What else do I have? Do I have other stuff? Yes, email me. Email me on this show at thehourofcomicsisupon@gmail.com. That's easy to remember. Takes about 15 minutes to type, but you can remember it. If you have like a series or a book or something that you would like us to talk about, send an email to thehourofcomicsisupon@gmail.com. Otherwise, I will be constantly updating the content and sending these guys idea after idea after idea, and we can only record like once every week or 2 weeks. And so the idea pile will be much larger than the execution pile, which is not a bad thing. So that's me. On that note, I would like to thank Greg Vorob, Keith Bliss, and Jason Gurin for doing this episode with me. Next time, hopefully, we will talk about something a little bit more popular, a little bit more interesting. Not to say that this was not interesting to talk about, but something more interesting to read in the first place. And so that's that for now, and good night.